Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Super Feeler podcast. We are here with our little group, Shanthi, Megan, and Dave, going through our DBT skills. Today, we're going to be talking about Chapter 2 of the DBT for Life book by Diana Partington. And this chapter is about Wise Mind, which is part of the mindfulness unit of dialectical behavior therapy, DBT. For context, all of us have borderline personality disorder diagnoses of various lengths. And we've all gone through dialectical behavior therapy in the past. If you want to know a little bit more about us as individuals, in the first episode that we did of this series, we did a bit more of an overview of who we are. So, and then also just important to note that none of us are clinicians. We're just here as people who have lived experience and are kind of relearning the skills as this little group, this little book club. So really happy to be able to have these conversations. So Wise Mind. This is a personal favorite skill of mine. Megan, I don't know how you feel about this, but at the beginning, I'm going to put you on the spot here. You can say no and I can edit it out. But at the beginning of each chapter, there's a bit of a story. And I know that this story might have resonated a little bit with you. And I'm curious if you wanted to summarize the story for us.
Yeah, for sure. So for some context, I read this and I immediately sent an Instagram message to Laurie going, "Woof, this is my life." And I was like, wow, I didn't expect to be called out in chapter 2 of this book. So I'm not surprised that you brought that one up. Yeah, so the story is essentially about utilizing the skill of Wise Mind to get out of what was, by all accounts, an abusive relationship, and how emotion mind can essentially have trapped this individual into a cycle of I want to say like quote unquote bad behaviors where they're making choices out of their emotion mind that if they were utilizing Wise Mind might not have done. For example, this one, the one that I'm on the page of right now, is that they might have used a stolen credit card to pay for a birthday dinner because they were afraid of the shame providing for this partner a birthday dinner, utilizing Wise Mind to get through that and then get through kind of the imposing or the resulting disappointment from their partner and the resulting actions from that. So I really found this one to be very interesting, having given some of my previous relationship history, and I was just like, ooh, this is exactly how things went down, and realizing that I was using Wise Mind before I really thought of it as Wise Mind, it's kind of like a nice little pat on the back for me as well to be like, wow, I definitely did use my skills, even though I forgot that I was using them. So it's amazing how sometimes reviewing these skills can kind of give you a little bit of a pat on the back. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan, for that summary. I really love Wise Mind as a concept. Is there anyone who wants to describe Wise Mind as the skill for people who may have not heard of it before?
I can.
Sure, go for it.
Wise Mind is a combination of emotional mind and reasonable mind. Reasonable or rational mind.
Okay, so it's really funny you say that because it used to be rational mind. And so when I interviewed her, I was like, wait, I've been calling it rational mind this whole time. Am I wrong or is it different? And she said that it's just like basically used interchangeably. So we can call it rational or reasonable, whichever works for us.
Okay. And there's a quote here that I really liked. Wise mind is always compassionate, but it also thinks through the consequences. So it's that combination mindset.
Yeah, thanks, Shanthi. Yeah, it's like a Venn diagram, right? Of you've got here. I should really find a way to like screen share, but that's not very clear. But you've got the wise or emotion mind on one side, the reasonable / rational mind on the other, and then Wise Mind in the middle. And yeah, like the goal is for us to be in Wise Mind, I guess, the majority of the time. Like we're never going to be able to be in it always. But I think it's important for us to even like remember that Wise Mind exists and that we don't have to live in one or the other, because I find my experience with dialectical behavior therapy has obviously, like, it saved my life. I love it to bits and it's so important to me. But I do feel like it almost moved me from living 90% in emotion mind kind of to maybe too much in the rational mind. So I find that in a lot of ways I've become a bit more like robotic and like very like 1+2=3 period. There's no like middle ground of like, well, maybe it's whatever. And so instead of moving from like black and white to gray, I moved from white to black with a bit of gray on occasion. And I don't actually think that that's the goal. I know that's not the goal of Wise Mind.
I think that is like a lot of things though, where like the pendulum kind of swings back and forth, and like you're never going to be perfectly centered in Wise Mind all the time, right? But it's about being able to like we're talking about with mindfulness, being able to bring yourself back to that kind of middle ground when one side's pulling too far or the other. I really like the quote that it's wise mind is the intersection of reason and emotion, seasoned with a little bit of intuition. Like listening to your gut there as well. I think it's always like the tendency when you learn a new skill is to like dive headfirst into it and maybe like overdo it. Like you think of like people training for like a marathon. They're like, I'm gonna run a marathon. And then they get like a runner's injury because they were like, let's run 20 kilometers on the first day. Because they just overdid it. And then they do it too little. And you just have to find that like happy medium ground, right? So I think that's a big part of Wise Mind for me anyways.
Happy medium ground of the pendulum swinging. I love that. I'm writing that down.
Megan, I think that was so important what you said about patting yourself on the back. And that's one of the things I really love about super feelers is we always start with wins. And sometimes I think it's easy. Sometimes in my therapy, I'll say to my therapist, "Oh, like I had some wins, but I don't know, I want to waste the time talking about it." She's always like, "No. Like it's really, even if they're small, it's so important to like acknowledge the times when things could have gone one way, or they used to go one way, and then I used skills, and it turned out a different way." And I think one of the things I really liked about just this story, but the stories in general, is like these stories are not, I mean, some intense stuff happens in them. And also they're not stories that like at the end, if it was a movie, the music swells and like the camera gets all soft focus and like the person at the center of the story who used skills, like everything's perfect. I mean, in this story, like she doesn't, it's things aren't, they probably don't work out the way that she would have completely liked them to. And like things could have been a lot worse. She could have wound up feeling much worse about herself. Maybe in this case, maybe gone to jail if she was using stolen credit cards. That's something that Wise Mind has helped me with, is that, yeah, like Wise Mind doesn't mean that I win all the time. But it does mean that like the ways that I used to react to like things not going my way, worrying about them, was like just start doing whatever came into my head. And a lot of times things would turn out way worse than they had to. So I think that really is the benefit of Wise Mind. I think that like the pendulum idea is, I think that's part of it. I think it's also like, I think for me, it's been important to look at them also as like two opposite things that again can both be completely valid. Like the reasonable thing can be completely valid, and the emotion mind thing can be completely valid. There was an example I was talking about in a group one time recently where, it's like if I'm going out to buy a house, I step into a house, like, my reasonable mind might be saying to me, like it's, I don't know if I can afford it, like look at this thing that's broken, we're gonna have to repaint it, like things like that. And my emotion mind might be at the same time saying, this house, it smells like my grandma's house used to smell when I was little, and there's like a feeling there that if I could just live in this house, I would be so happy and it would be so comfortable. And it's not, to me, it's not about picking between those two things. It's noticing that both of those things are happening in my mind and then using that to make a decision about what to do that honors both of those things.
Does anybody else find that when they're in therapy or like group and they're talking about a situation and then they're like, well, I know my rational mind is XYZ, and I know my emotion mind is XYZ, and I realize that wise mind is whatever, but I don't want to do wise mind. I want to stay in emotion mind, or I'm so able to identify which ones they are, and like it's helpful, I guess. But then it's like, how do you actually stay? I guess what Megan was saying is that you don't stay, right? You constantly bounce back and forth. But yeah, I just sometimes I find it like so helpful to be able to identify those things. And then other times I'm like, Laurie, just like figure it out. Like it's not that hard. And I just, depending on the situation, just like I can identify it and I just can't put myself in wise mind, even if I know what it is.
Yeah, a trick that I typically use for that is that like I notice I'm so good at, or not so good, but sometimes I'm so good at identifying whether it's emotion mind or rational mind or wise mind. And I kind of have a rule of thumb that if I am in emotion, I have to, before acting on what emotion mind wants, I have to wait a specified period of time, just to like deal with the impulsivity that I like really have a problem with. Like, even if it's something really good, like there was one day I was like, I want to quit work. I am going to start my own firm. And I was like, ooh, let me like decide all of these things for my firm. And I was like, Megan, no, take like a week. You don't need to go into rational mind yet. You can be super excited about starting your own firm. Then in a week, I was like, I actually really like my job. I'm really happy with where I am. And obviously didn't quit because I'm still there. So, but like making myself that rule of thumb to say, like, don't make an impulsive decision based on one mind or the other. Just allow yourself to like, you can feel your feels for a little bit, whether that's emotion mind, rational mind, or wise mind. Um, feel your feels. We're super feelers. It's important to feel those feelings and not just shut them down, but maybe not acting on them until you've had like a second thought, whether that's your own second thought or like checking in with someone else, being like, do I really need to purchase this $100 purse when there's like a $10 version? But this one's really pretty, and my emotion mind really wants this purse. So I don't know, just having that second thought, and that like time gap. It's not a bad thing to be an emotion mind. Is just what I'm kind of trying to get at.
I feel like so much. I don't want to speak for all of us, but I'll speak for myself, and you guys can nod along. I feel like we've been demonized for being an emotion mind for so much of our lives that we don't necessarily validate that emotion mind is positive sometimes, and like it is, like our super feeling is a great thing, and like sometimes it comes and bites us in the ass, don't get me wrong, but so much of the time it is like what makes us excitable and like passionate. And sometimes there's things that we do that aren't wise mind, but they end up being like beautiful, awesome things because we just like took it and ran with it. It's such a helpful skill. And I think in the book, what she says is like it amplifies all other DBT skills because you kind of need that ability to determine what is emotion and what is rational. I think maybe rational, like maybe that's why they call it reasonable, because like rational almost is like too robotic. But I think the intuition piece as well isn't something that is in normal DBT and is important because, yeah, like Dave was saying about the house or Megan was saying about the job, sometimes your gut knows something that your wise mind might not. And like you still have to be able to follow your gut in that circumstance.
I feel like maybe they changed it because rational is like a little judgy than more than reasonable.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, it is a little judgy. So on page 45, there's like a little bit of a list that I thought was kind of helpful around ideas for practicing wise mind. So, she talks a little bit about like practicing by asking yourself, am I in wise mind? And I think we've already talked about that in a bit of detail around like identifying the different sides. I mean, I've literally drawn a Venn diagram and written lists of what my feelings are in each of them and then trying to find wise mind. That can be really helpful. And then I love this. How do you identify if it's emotion mind? You'll recognize emotion mind by the sense of urgency and intensity that you feel. 100%, right? Like Megan was saying about the purse. If you like need that purse so bad, that means you probably don't need that purse. If nobody's going to die because you didn't buy this purse, you probably don't need this purse. But the more excited you get, the more like impulsive it is and easy to get to. And they talk about weighing pros and cons, which DBT has a very specific pros and cons like process, is like a 4-part pros and cons as opposed to a 2-part pros and cons. Does anybody find this particularly helpful?
Can I just say one thing really quick, just following up on what you said?
Yeah.
I think that urgency is a good sign for the emotion mind. It's a good reminder. And then also, I like down here when they talk about reasonable mind, they really identify this as should ideas. And I hadn't always thought about should being a sign that I'm using reasonable mind. I mean, that's something that, my therapist is real big on, is paying attention to shoulds. But that's absolutely what should is when you're stuck in reasonable, rational mind. And that should set off alarm bells. Who's saying it should?
Yeah, and is that the judgment too that Shanthi was talking about around well, I mean, in law, like a reasonable person would do XYZ. And like the joke that Aaron and I always have, because we both did criminology, is like, there is no such thing as a reasonable person. Like law always uses, I don't know if about in the States, but like in Canada, at least, like our entire criminal code is about like what a reasonable person would do. And it's like, well, I have yet to meet a reasonable person. So that's kind of ironic. What culture is this reasonable person from? And like, how does that impact what they're considered like rational or reasonable or whatever? Is really interesting. So pros and cons. So they use this 4-part pros and cons. It's basically like pros. So this example is talking about like leaving her boyfriend. So pros of leaving Adam, cons of leaving Adam, pros of staying with Adam, and cons of staying with Adam. And I remember when I first did dialectical behavior therapy, this was very like confusing for my brain for some reason. It's like, it kind of felt like unnecessary. I do think there's value in it, but like realistically, when I'm doing pros and cons lists on like a regular basis, I'm probably only doing like a 2-part pros and cons.
In this chapter, there's like the example one, and then they also have like the super helpful blank one if you want to do it yourself for like another one. So like pros and cons of making the change, and pros and cons of not making the change. And I think for me that what's been really valuable is looking at the pros and cons of not making the change, because something that I learned very early in like my legal career is like doing nothing is an option. That's always a recommendation that we provide as like an option to our clients, because sometimes you don't need to do anything, or you don't need to do anything yet. That can be really helpful with that like wise mind, emotion mind, like impulsivity is like, do I need, using the purse example, do I need to buy the purse right now? No, like there's nobody with a gun to my head saying buy this purse or else I'll like shoot your family. And if there is, well then not doing something is probably not a choice that I want to make. But I can always revisit these decisions. Like it's not like you have to make this pros and cons list once and stick with the result till the end of time. And I find that that's really helpful for like shifting grounds. And also, if you like kind of go back to your pros and cons list later, maybe there's something that's shifted. Maybe you made this entire pros and cons list in emotion mind, and then you made it in reasonable mind. And then you can look and go, oh, well, I don't really actually count that. Or I do really, like, that is a really important part of this pro and con list. And I think that that's also really helpful of like, you don't have to like stick with your first answer is not your final answer, right? So
yeah, I think that's really helpful reframing. And I love the concept of coming back to your list later, because I've done that where like you see a pros and cons list that you've written like 2 months ago and you're like laughing at yourself about how like stupid some of these pros and cons were, because realistically, like it's fine. Like it's not, you were way too much an emotion mind to be able to reasonably actually come up with a pros and cons list that was valuable. Okay, a couple other things about the practicing wise mind. So the other practice idea, when you're feeling overwhelmed, Try placing your hand on your solar plexus. What is that? Is that like here? Here? Breathing into the center of your body, asking yourself, what does wise mind say? Listen for the answer deep within yourself. Don't just tell yourself the answer, just listen.
Just for those who are not watching, we had our hands like on our sternum over our hearts.
Smart. That's a good point. We're all just like, yeah,
Right
yeah,
here.
for sure. And people are just like, what? That's not helpful. Yes. Thank you, Dave. Smart. Yeah. And then the other one was set a couple of reminders on your phone to take a temperature check of your emotions, and rate them on a scale of 0 to 10. And then saying like, is this a good time to act? Am I an emotion mind or reasonable mind or emotion mind? Or wise mind, whichever one I missed. I like that concept. I would be curious if anybody actually does that, because that actually comes up in the next chapter that we're going to do as well, about the stop skill, about setting these reminders. Like, is anybody actually doing that? And then if they are they actually looking at the reminders?
I feel like it's more practical to do it for stop than for wise mind.
I think using like reminders and like to stop and like check in with yourself is a good skill to utilize when you're like starting and you're like, well, because I know like sometimes I had a harder time engaging with a skill because I'd only think about it when I was in distress. And so like getting the practice in there, being like, okay, it's noon. Am I wise mind, reasonable mind, or emotion mind? And if you can identify that at noon on a Tuesday, where like hopefully everything's going okay, well, then maybe you're going to be able to identify it in like a more traumatic situation if you've already practiced and flexed those muscles. Not saying that I've done it per se, but I can see the like rationale behind setting the reminders.
Agreed.
Yeah. I really like what both of you guys said. I think that in the practice, but then also, I haven't done it, but I think I might try if I'm coming into like a difficult day or a particularly difficult week. And that does become a stop skill thing, even if it doesn't quite feel like it's going to be a crisis, just like feeling kind of wound up and tired and be going into work. I actually might try setting just like a reminder at times of the day that I know I'm likely to be sort of like grumpy, just to check in with myself. I think that's actually a really good idea.
The next session you're in, Dave, we should check in with you on that and see how it went, because I'm really curious. It's very similar, I guess, to when you're first doing DBT and you've got the daily diary card. Thank you. So basically you're like rating your emotions and like talking about what skills you have. I guess it's very similar to that. It's just like a more modern version. I'm sure DBT now has like apps that ask you to rate those on a regular basis anyways. So yeah, just something that maybe you, like Megan said, you don't need forever because you have these kind of like embedded in your life.
I still do diary cards, and I find them
Do you?
very helpful. And maybe now that you mention it, that probably serves that function for me. Just the idea of like sitting down. I do it in the morning when I wake up, sitting down and being like, because it's not just like, like thinking about the times when I use skills or maybe didn't or what I'm feeling from yesterday, but it's also like a reminder going into the day of like, here's the list of skills, like, and it helps throughout the day. I would recommend that not just for people who are beginners, but to, if you feel like, when I feel like I'm having trouble remembering to use skills, I always come back to using the diary card, and it always helps with that.
That's so cool. I don't think I've used a diary card in like 8 years. But I totally see why it would be beneficial if you have that as part of your like normal routine. Right. Well, thank you all so much. This has been super fun. I'm so excited for our next skill that we're going to do, which is going to be observe and stop. We already got a little preview of stop today, so that's super awesome. And yeah, I'll see you all at the next recording.
Good.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Superfeeler podcast. Today's episode was recorded on the unceded and traditional territory of the Matsqui and Sumas First Nations. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps me reach more listeners like you, and we're always looking for improving the podcast. Remember, you can always stay connected with me on social media. You can follow us. The show notes will have all of the details for Instagram profiles. If you want to support the podcast and help me continue to bring great content, please consider joining the Superfeeler community on Patreon. Your support really means the world to me, and there's a variety of different options for support, including some free ones. For all information about the Super Feelers Club, which is the peer support that we run, including upcoming events and resources, head over to Eventbrite or laurieedmondson.com for more information. And if you have a topic that you want me to cover or a guest you'd love to hear from, please send me the suggestions. Always happy to hear them. Until next time, keep on super feeling and living authentically. This is Laurie signing off of the Super Feeler podcast.